Hey there, boys, girls, and flying squirrels. My name's Joe Keyport, and you're listening to the Ear Coffee Podcast. For this week's episode, I sat down with local singer-songwriter Anna Marie Carey to discuss her new worship record with her band Astronauts. Even though Anna is a worship leader at a local church and she's written a ton of music and been in the worship realm for a long time, this album with Astronauts is her first foray into the worship music realm. It was really interesting to hear her talk about her writing process, as when she wrote her 2015 album Pulse of My Heart, she locked herself in a room while scenes from her favorite films played in front of her so she could write her songs. I hope you guys enjoy this one. She's a really great writer and a really cool musician. This is Anna Marie Carey on the Ear Coffee Podcast. I am sitting here with Anna Carey of Anna Carey, I guess. Local singer-songwriter, worship leader, what else? Filmmaker?
Not so much these days.
Not so much these days? You're focusing more on the music?
I do video productions a little bit, but yeah.
Is that from the church you work at?
Yep.
Calvary?
Yep, Calvary Church in Roseville. Yeah.
Gotcha. And that's, I don't know, I'm trying to think of any other descriptors.
Abstract weirdo, I don't know. Yeah.
Fair.
Aren't we all?
And you are working on a newer project. Is this for astronauts?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I didn't realize this was an astronauts project until like an hour ago, and I was like,
Great.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, thankfully I've rewritten most of my questions.
That's great.
But so you've been writing for a while. You've released a handful of albums as Anna Carey.
Yeah.
And you've released one. You have How Droll, which was your Christmas project.
How Droll. That's right.
And then you have Astronauts. Has Astronauts released?
Never.
So this is the first official release for Astronauts?
Yeah, but we've been working on these things for years, so it's really weird.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's start kind of at the beginning. Because you come from a creative family.
Yep.
Brett is a musician, but we're not here to talk about Brett.
No.
We're here to talk about your stuff. And so what kind of started you in your songwriting and performing process?
Yeah, well, my parents are both musicians. They met in a band, and they were kind of on sort of the cutting edge of worship ministries back in the day. You know, they introduced a drum set into the worship space, and that was kind of considered taboo at the time. And so they taught us a lot when we were kids. My dad would always have us in the studio. He always had access to a studio, or we had one in our house. So we would often play around with him. And my brother didn't turn out to be very musical until later in life, and it was more my passion that came through with my parents. And it was really quickly that we got roped into worship ministries as a family when we started with a church plant that started up in Roseville, and they needed a family to support their worship ministry. So we as a family led worship together. But I wrote music as a kid, and my brother and I would have fake bands, or my cousins would have fake bands. And so we'd record, cassette tapes where we'd kind of hum the background music as we're singing. And that was a huge part of my story, was just writing all the time as a kid. And it was mostly nonsense. And as I grew up and started to understand what music could do and how music could share stories and how it could express a lot of what I deal with, that's when I really started to take it very seriously. And that was about in high school when I started to write music really seriously. And I didn't release really... The first project that I was proud of wasn't until after college, actually. Okay. And that was called Cry of My Heart. Okay. And that was... one of the more interesting forays in writing that I've pursued, because I up until that point I listened to such a wide variety of music, but I didn't like anything that I was producing. And so that made it really challenging to want to write when I didn't think that it was something that even I would want to listen to. And so out of college, I took a break during college to just pursue film. And then when I came out of that, post-college life is a drag. And so I learned a lot about rediscovering myself. And I think a lot of people go through that. Yeah. I struggle with anxiety and a little bit of depression. So that was a part of my story. And that really heightened after college, because you're in these structures that are laid out for you. And now all of that is gone. I based my life on getting good grades, and now I don't have that. I had friends that I was around all the time, and now they're further apart. They're in their own jobs. And so that first album was kind of written about rediscovering those emotions and how even exhaustion as a simple emotion was different. I wasn't exhausted from working too hard. I was exhausted from the lack of working too hard. So it was just kind of this rediscovery. And where do I see God fitting into that picture and rediscovering what my faith meant, making that more personal. And that's a huge part of my story. And so music at that point became a way for me to process what I was dealing with. And so I wrote music kind of based out of these seasons of life. And so that's what really took my music to the kind of the next level. So. Okay.
So then did Cry of My Heart kind of connect into what would have been 2015's Pulse of My Heart then?
2015. You got your dates. That's crazy. It's weird to think that it was that long ago. Yes, it was meant to be a kind of a one of 3 pieces or 4 pieces. I hadn't really decided, and it only ended up being 2. I don't know. Maybe there's one in the future. But yeah, Pulse of My Heart was based out of a season of rediscovering what relationships meant, what friendships meant, what relationships meant. And it was by far the most vulnerable album I've written. I usually try to write very poetic in a way where the lyrics don't necessarily tie directly to exact moments in my life, but they tie to themes. Pulse of My Heart ties to direct moments in my life. And I didn't want to write that way originally because then I feel like I can get stuck there. Yeah. And you can write music in 2 ways. Well, there's more than 2 ways, but you can write it so that you are building yourself kind of out of that memory and kind of releasing it into the world and kind of letting go of those emotions, or it can keep you stuck there. And Pulse of My Heart can do a little bit of both depending on how I listen to it. And so I wrote in really specific memories. That's really hard for me to even continue to process, but it was good for me to let go of some of those things and just say they are what they are. And at the time when I wrote the album, I felt really positive about those memories. And then as the album progressed, those things changed for me and those relationships changed for me, and they grew more and more challenging, and processing what it meant to be in an intentional relationship and having to realize that maybe not all of my relationships are positive, and maybe I need to learn what it means to push some people to the side for a season of life. And that's a hard thing to do when you really care about the people in your life. So that album was really kind of a piggyback off of what Cry of My Heart was. Okay. So yeah, they were kind of interconnected, but out of 2 really different seasons of life. So. Okay.
Then you don't perform a ton as Anna Carey?
No, I did for a bit, but I kind of knew that worship ministries was more my calling. Your calling? Okay. So I perform in a way every week. Yeah. You know, I'm always...
But it's a different form of performing.
Yes. So it doesn't leave a lot of extra time. Okay. And my weekends are just shot, obviously. Yeah. Working in a church. So
then when you did perform the songs from Cry of My Heart and Pulse of My Heart, were they difficult to perform, or were they...
Absolutely. Yeah. My CD release show, we performed Pulse of My Heart. Obviously, it was one of the biggest accomplishments I think I've ever had, just because it was such a vulnerable moment. And some of the people who were involved in creating that piece of my life are sitting before me, and to perform in front of family and friends, A, is hard enough, B, to do it with such a vulnerable album. And this is, I think, the one space in my life, performing, where I feel like I'm fully myself. And I think a lot of musicians kind of feel that way. Film is another way that I express myself, but to be fully myself in that moment was so huge for me. And to just say, this is who I am, this is what I've written, because I discover a lot about myself when I'm writing. I discover a lot about what God's trying to do in my life. And so it was really cool to have that come all together, but to perform those things is always so hard. But I had a huge support network in the band that wrote the album with me, and Pulse of My Heart was more collaborative than Cry of My Heart. Okay. Where Cry of My Heart, we just kind of told musicians, this is what we're looking for. Pulse of My Heart was a little more, let's ebb and flow with each other. And my brother was a huge part of the writing process for both albums, but really for Pulse of My Heart in a really perfect way. And he is a huge part of my story. So obviously I wanted him involved. And Caleb Anderson, who's played with my brother in Calvin Heights and who's Aldrich as well. And Ben McEwen, who's in all of those groups, and they're all in Astronauts as well. We collaborated together, and it was just really perfect to see it all pieced together. And they're people that I trust. They're like family. So it was cool to share that space with them. And it continues to be cool to share the stage with them. So,
you mentioned that Ben and Brett and Caleb all were part of the early, like Pulse My Heart and Cry My Heart, and they're in Astronauts, do you find that you write with them more frequently, or I should say, when it comes to writing pieces, and do you collaborate with them more often, or does it kind of depend on what you're doing?
Almost exclusively I collaborate with them because I'm so protective of my process, and it's a very vulnerable thing for me. Pulse of My Heart especially, because I had fallen in love with film in such a real way through college, I knew that film had to be a part of the album. So I spent a lot of time, I work solely on the lyrics. They're all mine. But in terms of music, we pieced that together. But when it came to writing those lyrics, I wanted to like be in an immersive experience where film was literally impacting me as I'm writing. So I sat in a projector playing scenes from different films that were impactful for me as a person and as an artist, but also that had influence and themes similar to each song. So actually each song title is related to a different film. I can't honestly remember what each film is at this point because that was so long ago. But but those moments are so vulnerable to me, and I want my band to know kind of the heart behind each song. It's the pulse of my heart, right? And so to collaborate with them is so sweet, but it takes a lot of trust. And I'm not a super trusting person, so to be able to do that with them, and to have them walk through that process and them hold kind of my vulnerability in their hand and take that as really precious was huge for me. But I have recently opened up that collaboration sphere. It's still really hard for me, but I'm learning to let other people into that process and respect kind of their creative talents. And I know that there are so many talented people in my sphere, just trying to understand how I can work best with others, and still be vulnerable, but protect my process as well.
Okay, so like with How Droll, your Christmas project, you worked with Nick Sorry, okay, and then Braden Watson, and Eric Holm, as drummer, and then is there a couple other people in there? Or?
Oh boy, I think that's the gist of it. Yeah, so my brother, obviously.
So your sphere's kind of expanding slowly, or? So Nick is part of my worship team at my church, and we had done like a couple of just like church gigs together, where we did some duet stuff, and he's super fun to work with. He's so talented, and we just decided it would be fun to try to collaborate on a Christmas song. I had written a song the year before Christmas Near that ended up on the How Droll albums, and I just needed a male vocalist, and he's such a strong vocalist, so I thought I'd toss him in, and I said, let's just do something fun. And so we threw some horns in there. He plays trombone, Braden played saxophone. We made it kind of jazzy, kind of fun and poppy. And it was fun to do something really different. It was still really hard for me, but he's someone that, I share an intimate space with, just in that we're on a worship team together, and that's already a vulnerable emotional space. So it wasn't very different from that. It was just a different type of emotion, I suppose. So it was cool. I don't write goofy songs well, and they're not goofy songs, but they definitely took a more of an emotional turn than I was expecting. So it was an interesting process. We collaborated on the lyrics and on the instrumentation, but I just threw a studio together in my basement when I moved into my house a year ago. So I thought I might as well use it. Let's find some ways to do that. So that's how Droll was started. Okay. And then a lot of your, at least, well, both sonically and visually, you draw a lot of inspiration from vintage things.
Oh, yes.
So what kind of draws you to kind of that vintage feeling? Because specifically like 1955 from How Droll, you kind of alluded in a post on social media that it kind of was inspired by the house you moved into.
My house was built in 1955, and I'm a weird individual who loves history to the point where I want to be living as though I'm in history. I don't know if you do strengths finders, but my top two strengths are context and futuristic, which seems like contradictory because context is always looking backward and futuristic is always looking forward, but it so describes who I am. And so I'm always thinking about the past and wondering what the past would have been like. And a lot of people think that way, but I can sometimes harbor a lot of feelings, just like feeling stuck in the past, which is why writing for me is a good release of the past. But I'm really drawn to the 50s and 60s for reasons I'm not exactly sure. And it started through film and then through just spending some time like studying. I just love studying history. I created some films, one that was set in the 40s, one that was set in the 50s. I wrote some films set in the 20s. I don't know, it's just such an interesting time period. The things that they deal with are so much different from what we're dealing with now, but at the same time, there's so much commonality. And 1968 is specifically a year that has really had influence on me just because it was loud and chaotic, and it was what we're dealing with right now. So there's so much to learn from history in that way. So when I think about my house, I specifically wanted to purchase a house that had the charm of when it was built. And I'm the second owner of my home, built in 1955. And there's really unique cutouts in the walls and texture and color. And so I wanted to kind of bring that into the album, since that was the first thing that was going to be created there. And so 1955 kind of alludes to, I wonder what life would have been back then in this house. What memories would have been a part of that? I told myself I would buy the house that I started to see when I walked in. I started to see scenes of life there, of like what life could have been there. Yeah. I know that's so strange, but I'm so visual. So, and that was my house. I saw people dancing in the living room and children running through the halls. I said, yeah, this is my house. And so I'm imagining, what would Christmas be like there? And are those memories going to be something that I'm going to make in the future? Or, you know, like, what is it going to look like now that I have my own space and I'm kind of on my own? So that's where things like 1955 really were inspiring. I don't know. Yeah.
It's very interesting because I also live in an older house. Mine was built a little, and it's interesting seeing what was part of the house, like part of the old, like, wood floors with the painting and the some of the weird architecture things. Yeah. It's interesting and very, not inspiring, because I'm not the most creative person, but like every once in a while it shows up. Yeah. So it's just using the space to your advantage. How does it work to record in your basement? Because have you set up like kind of a studio thing?
Sort of.
Or is it kind of like a space you just kind of put stuff there and aim for the best?
Eventually we're going to really remodel and build a studio. It has no ceiling right now, and it's a mostly finished basement. But the important thing were computers and microphones, and then plugging things in. And luckily my dad has pieces of a studio that he has let me use, and Nick Sorry had some pieces that he let me use as well. Really nice microphone. And so, you just turn off the heating unit when you're ready to sing so that doesn't make noise, and there you go. And like, I'm not great at mixing and producing. I produced that album by myself, but I love it. So it does, to me, like, it's more the process that's important to me. And I can hear some of the weird things in the track that are characteristic of my house making noise or whatever it is, but I kind of love it. Like, it doesn't have to be perfect to me, and I'm just all about learning. So I was glad to be able to try to mix it myself and getting input from other people to help me. But it was so fun to just like track it, like tracking drums. We don't have a separate room for that, so we just threw 2 overhead mics on a drum kit and just call it good, and you just turn off the audio and there you go. Like, I don't know, it's a little sketchy, but it's super fun. Yeah. So eventually we'll make it more professional. Yeah.
Because I remember seeing photos of an amplifier next to like what would have been a washing machine. Yeah.
Yeah. You got to use the space that you have.
Definitely.
So it's fun though.
Yeah. And then kind of switching gears to the new record you're working on.
Yeah.
So mentioned earlier, worship music has been kind of in your blood and since the beginning.
Right.
And this is the first release for the band Astronauts. How do you go about writing worship music? Because it's such I know it's a weird question. It's a very broad question, but the music doesn't serve the same doesn't serve the same purpose as like traditional quote unquote pop music.
Right.
So like, is it stories or is it feelings or is it what kind of brings that about?
Yeah. This is a really interesting journey for me. I have always felt really comfortable writing music for myself. And knowing that the music that I write for myself has a greater purpose than just it being for myself. But with worship music, there's this extra set of pressures. You're writing on behalf of like a whole massive group of people. You're writing on behalf of a lot of people who are dealing with really tough things in faith, who are striving for clarity in their life and joy and peace and all these things. And you're trying to write that into, it's just like huge amount of pressure. And I vowed never, ever, ever to write worship music. So, of course, here I am. And it's kind of a funny thing to say the word never, especially the word never in front of God, because when you say that, you're limiting what God can do in your life. You're not limiting God. Obviously, You're not going to limit him, but you're definitely going to limit his impact on your life if you're not willing to receive the gifts that he's given you. And it took a lot of people to encourage me, and a lot of tries and fails and errors. But I attempted that. I was probably in high school. I tried writing worship music, and that's when I was like, oh, this is cliche and dumb, and I should just never do this again. At the time, and I think this is really changing in worship music, there was not a lot of artistic worship music.
Yeah.
Maybe something underground. I don't know. But a lot of bands were just making the 4 chords. It's right in front of you. It's really easy to grasp onto, but there was no depth in it. Maybe it was theologically sound, but it just didn't. It was either too Christianese that the words didn't. I'm done singing about waves. I'll tell you that much. That it didn't really have an impact, or it was too deep that it wasn't easy to grasp, because that's the challenge with worship music. You want to cause people to think, but they're singing it, one time in a service. They got to grasp enough of it. And so I don't honestly remember how this happened, but I had a lot of people at my former church who would come up to me and give me their opinions on what worship music was or what worship music wasn't. And that started to shape kind of my view in a negative way. And I started to think, Lord, it just doesn't seem like that's what you've created worship music to be. And I just remember like struggling with that. And he said, well, why don't you just write your story? Why don't you just write your struggles into worship music? I was like, well, but it's not about me. He's like, but that's how you're going to write it. And that's what I'm asking you to do. And I never really thought of worship music being personal or a story. But as you read the hymns, for example, or any worship leader these days who are writing music, they're writing it from their personal story. And so that's really all that it is, built on theological truths and how God's moving in our life. And so that's where it started, was just trying to understand, what is God doing? And at the time, I didn't really realize what I was writing. I was writing about a miraculous God that I wasn't quite convinced was miraculous. I was writing a lot of songs about how sometimes I don't know how to talk to God. And so it was really interesting, the struggle in that has now not completely resolved now, but that I do believe in a miraculous God. I do believe I can speak wholeheartedly to him. The first song that I wrote is called Wordless, and that'll be on the new record. That song is based off a passage in Romans that says that the Spirit intercedes for us on our behalf when all we can produce are like wordless groans. We don't have anything else. And oftentimes I come before the Lord going, I don't even know what to say anymore. And I think a lot of us feel that. And to be encouraged that the Spirit is working on our behalf. He knows our heart and our desires, and he's going to speak to the Lord on our behalf. I mean, that's amazing. And so things like that, these revelations that I had, I was like, yeah, that needs to be written. And I wanted it to have that artistic vein as well, so that it was interesting for people like me who are music junkies and who love creativity. And I think worship music is shifting more in that way in some groups. And that's really encouraging because it's a little more authentic. And that's what I wanted to do, was create something that was unique and authentic, but that just represented a little bit of my heart. And I think a lot of people could resonate with that. So, yeah.
So since you mentioned that you've been working on Astronauts for a number of years, how long have these songs been in the works? Have they been in the works for have they been started to be written recently, or have they been kind of been rewritten or written and sat in like the vault for like 10 years kind of a thing?
Sat in the vault. So I started, 3 or 4 years ago. I honestly don't remember the exact timeline of it, but I was at the church previous to where I work now. And that's when I started to write the first, I think 3 or 4 tracks, maybe 5 tracks. Yeah, the first 5 tracks that are going to be on the album. And that was exciting and electrifying. I didn't know what to do with it at the time, and I didn't have a group to put together, and I didn't know if anybody would even want to collaborate with me. And then I just went back to my roots, and I asked Caleb, Brett, and Ben, I said, do you want to do this? Let's make worship music, I guess. I don't know. And they are all involved in worship ministries in their own ways. And so it was really cool to collaborate together as a worship group. And that's kind of the goal of the group, is to bring worship ministries, people together from different churches, and to kind of create something as one group, because I think a lot of times churches feel like they need to be separate from each other, which baffles me. And so this is a small way of us bringing different denominations and different churches together. But we recorded them, and I think 2016, and refreshed them in 2017, and they sat around for a really long time for a lot of different reasons. But our producer is Micah Engel, who's produced Calvin Heights and a lot of other things. He produced Pulse of My Heart, and I hired him at my church full time, and it was a new role as a technical director. And so a lot of things just really got consumed by that job, which I totally understood. And so I kind of blame myself, which is fine. So, and I really wanted his input on the project. And so we just waited for his kind of availability. And so we revived the tracks again in 2017, like I said. And then from there, it just like took time, and goodness, it was frustrating and no one to blame. But I just was like, Lord, it feels like there's a reason for this. And what I kind of said earlier, I didn't really internalize what those songs had meant. And it's interesting, when I write worship music, it doesn't, and I listen back to these songs specifically, it doesn't feel like I wrote them. It feels like someone else wrote them, and they're fresh to me when I hear them, and they impact me, which is a really strange feeling, to have your music impact you so directly. And so I realized that I needed to grow in my faith in a lot of ways and understand who God really was, because I didn't have a full understanding. I had a really limited view. I squished him into a box, and I said, this is the God that I'm going to believe in. And really, essentially what it came down to is I didn't believe that God was good in my life, but he was good to other people. There's really no foundation for why I believed that. But I've always taken kind of the harder path in life. I've always really struggled with anxiety, like I said. So everything to me was a challenge, and it still is on some level, but I don't know where I would be without the Lord and without the Holy Spirit guiding me. So a lot of that was just, I needed to grow into the music and realize that what I was singing was truth. And now I can sing it just with this totally different spirit, and it just takes on this totally different energy. And so out of that, I wrote 3 new songs, and those were just written within the last couple months. Okay. So we recorded 3 other songs. So there's going to be a total of 8 tracks for this season of life, but they're going to be kind of spread out separately. And so those 3 take on a really different like energy and different vibe. And that's where I collaborated with even more people from my worship team and from other places. And so that is an even more special project, because they were written in this really kind of new revived season of life. So yeah, it was a long process of waiting, but I'm getting good at waiting, I guess, these days. I don't know.
I mean, sometimes you gotta sit on something for it to like really take shape, and so you don't release something half-baked or something you kind of find, oh, this could have been better with insert this.
Yeah. I'm a very organized person. I like schedules, so that doesn't always go over well with me. Yeah.
And so Micah has produced most of it, all of it?
Yeah, part of it.
Part of it?
Yeah.
Okay.
My brother took over, and he's been mixing the final tracks.
Okay.
Yeah, as my brother's kind of been discovering more about that passion. So.
And I know Erin Kluver, for her senior project, took over like initial like tracking and sort of mixing duties.
Yes, she did.
So she's no longer involved then with that once.
Yeah, so she did the 3 new tracks as part of her project, and she wanted to record for her senior project a grouping of songs from our worship team, because she's been connected to Calvary and really loves it. So it was really cool for us to like kind of almost thank her in a way, because she serves us so well, and she does an amazing job mixing for us at Calvary. And so we just grabbed a bunch of volunteers, and we threw these songs together. I had written these 3 songs a while ago, and no one had heard them. And so we kind of connected all the dots on the spot. Yeah, in a live recording session. So those 3 tracks will be released separately. She did the initial mixing, and we're going to clean up some things. And so, yeah, she was instrumental in making that happen, which is awesome.
And that was, and the last 3 tracks were recorded in Calvary, right? Yeah. So you get to have part of the church in the recording. Yeah, and some of our volunteers were a part of that too. So that's just even more sweet. That's huge, because they've been instrumental in my journey as discovering who I am as a worship leader. And so it's really cool to have those people involved. And I'm all about, like I said, the process. So it's really important to me that
the people that are involved are really bought into this and have importance in my life.
Yeah.
So it was really cool.
And then so these collections of songs are going to be released in 2 parts, or are they going to be part of one
2 parts.
big? So you're going to have like essentially smaller EPs?
Kind of. Well, I guess it's not 2 parts, more 4.
Oh.
But sort of. So the 3 songs are in a grouping of singles.
Okay.
And so they're thematically kind of the same, but we'll release them as singles to kind of tease what the new album is going to be. And so the full album is still only 5 songs.
Okay.
So they're shorter.
Gotcha.
But yeah, I hope that people resonate with them lyrically, but also just that they're unique and they're interesting.
Oh, yeah.
And you've heard my brother's music. It's interesting. So we kind of try to add a little bit of everything into this. So
yeah. It was very interesting, just to go on a little sidetrack, when I saw a Calvin Heights show and he was performing as an old woman.
Yes.
And to him come off stage and go, it was all for Jesus, which is kind of brings that like worship is so much more than just a collection of songs you'll sing at church.
Yeah. And for me, I don't typically worship the best to worship music.
No. It's
changed a lot in the last year, but to me, watching films is a really huge way that I see God, and a really huge way that my pastor just said this weekend. There's a quote from someone who said, every book is about God. Every movie is about God, whether or not they're explicitly like showing that God isn't present in this world. Then it's the absence of God, and then it's the search for God. And I find that that's so interesting, watching characters in movies looking for something and not realizing what it is, and knowing that I have that hope in Christ, or in music or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So even secular music is a way that I really experience who God is through creativity. Just creativity in general just inspires me. So it's really interesting to now be writing so directly in that vein of worship music as a genre, which I don't know if that should even be a genre. We can get into that later, but
well, it's like creativity is one of the first classes. If you have our professor here, Mark Senius, one of the first classes you'll have with him, he'll say creativity is the closest thing we can be to acting like God, because he spoke the world and created the world in existence.
He's the creator. Yeah. And I don't connect with non-creative people. I'm sorry, I'm just going to say it, because I do feel like I get to understand a little more the mind of God through how he's inspired me to create. And it's really been a huge discovery for me to not try to squash that creativity and not try to let my ego get in the way of that. Because sometimes I get so paranoid about, if I'm writing worship music, are people going to think that I'm only in this or at this church to promote my own music? And so it makes me fearful of even wanting to play anything that I've written. And God's like, I asked you to write this music. This is my music. So don't be afraid of who the author is. Just play it. It's meant to be played. It's meant to be sung. And I hope that not just my church can be able to sing it at some point in the future, but that other churches around the Twin Cities can do that, as, churches like River Valley, Eaglebrook are producing their own music as well. And so it's cool to see how other creators are coming forward and writing their own stuff. And we want to be a part of that too, just in a little bit different way.
Have you have you played your worship tracks for your church, or led them for your church?
No.
Do you hopefully, or you mentioned you want to at some point, do you think that's sometime in the near future, or?
This is still the inner battle that I'm struggling with. We are hoping to do a worship night.
Okay.
And my heart would be that it would be at my church.
Okay.
Just so that we can... It's been so instrumental in my journey, like I said, and there's history in my church because my grandparents go there. My mom grew up there, so there's some really like sweet, poetic value to that in a way.
Was the church you work at now, was that the church you helped plant with?
No, okay. That was in Compass Church, where my brother's actually the worship leader. Yeah, so we're both worship leaders. It's cute, whatever.
Do you have a planned release for your singles or the album, or are you still?
I'm scared to say it in case it doesn't happen, but I'll say it. Why not? June 29th is the hope for the first single. It's called Here in This Moment, and it's absolutely my favorite one out of all of them. Most days.
Most days.
I actually really like them all, which is really interesting. That's weird for me. But it's my birthday that week, so I'm really hoping and praying that it can come out. It's my golden birthday. This is the only thing I want, is this to be released finally. And then we will release the full album in August. Okay. And it'll be kind of punctuated by the worship night.
Yeah.
And if that's not at Calvary, it'll be somewhere else. But we want to play the music and get people to sing. And ultimately, it's just going to be a worship experience. Mm-hmm. It's not really about what we're doing, but just to celebrate how God's inspired us in this way and hopefully can inspire others and encourage them. So, yeah, there are some plans. We still need to work out the details as we're musicians and flaky and all that fun stuff. So,
yeah, creatives always have a hard time maybe sticking to plans. And
yes. I've never had like a release date actually come when I was hoping that it was going to. So, yeah.
Well, Anna, I thank you for coming on the podcast and sharing, because it's always very insightful to hear somebody explain their music.
Yes.
And as somebody who's been a fan here as the student radio station we're in at the moment. And it's always interesting to talk to somebody about what they've created.
Yeah. Well, I hope other people are inspired to create as well. That's why we're here, right?
Definitely, yeah. All right.
Cool.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
That has been my interview with Anna Marie Carey here on the Ear Coffee Podcast. I hope you guys enjoyed it. My name is Joe Keyport, and make sure to come back Wednesdays for more Ear Coffee Podcasts. We're hoping to get musicians on the podcast as well as some other things going on. We're kind of going through our summer growing pains as we figure out what we're doing with our lives. Check us out on Facebook.com/earcoffee and on earcoffee.blogspot.com for all of your local music and national music news. I have been Joe Keyport. I'll see you guys later.